This is a case of everybody in every season, if Manchester City are found guilty, redoing the table, and if you were impacted, there will be a door open for damages.
Numerous teams with numerous claims.
It would be Manchester City asked to stump up that bill.
If these claims were proven against City, then it would be City who would be liable ultimately for the compensation. Keep the lawyers in a job, that's for sure.
In 2022, Arsenal were talking about multi-club, and it hasn't happened. This isn't about Edu not believing in the Arsenal project, it's perhaps about Edu wanting more power.
How much did the Erik Ten Hag venture cost Manchester United?
The costs of hiring and then firing him, all of that together may make him one of the most expensive managers in Premier League history.
Hello, this is How Football Works. I'm Olly Clink. With me today, Man City's former financial advisor, Stefan Borson, and talkSPORT reporter, Ben Jacobs. Gentlemen, great to have you along. Let's get straight to it. Just firstly, Stefan, we're hearing the result of the American election this morning. Donald Trump looking like he is making his way in again to the Oval Office. In terms of football in the UK, we've seen so much American investment. How much of an impact could this new presidency have?
Yeah, I think the biggest impact is probably likely to be sort of broader on the economic side of things. So the markets in the run-up to this election have been perceiving Trump to be the favourite to win, and therefore likely to be inflationary in terms of his policies, particularly things like tariffs. Now, if we have an inflationary environment, that is likely to make the reduction of interest rates that are ongoing slower and possibly even start to tick back up. Now, the impact of high interest rates on football are clear where you talk about the number of clubs that are funded by debt. And that's particularly true where teams are building stadiums, and have other lending. So we know that a number of clubs have got pretty substantial debt to third parties. Anybody from Chelsea on one side, Spurs obviously, although Spurs' debt is largely fixed in terms of its interest rates. Manchester United, and of course United on top of that if they were to build a stadium. So it would have a very serious impact if interest rates were to stay at these sorts of levels throughout the next 4 years. And so I think that would be the biggest impact on English football generally. There's two sides to it, but look, we're on the first day. It's literally just happened. But I do think that the markets are saying interest rates higher for longer. And that is an issue for really not just English sport, but the European game. We know that is now becoming, the cost of debt is becoming an issue across Europe.
And Ben, as Stefan mentioned there, there is a mix in terms of the donations put forward by some of the names that we know of in UK football. Avram Glazer reportedly donates to Harris. Edward Glazer donated $2 million to Trump. John Textor has donated to the Republicans in the past. Dan Freakin as well, coming in at Everton, has backed the Republicans too. So there does seem to be a mix in terms of the support and which kind of government they feel would be best for the US and potentially best for their interests.
If we remove sport in America, international sport and Trump should coexist just fine, because some of these investors he's in with, as Stefan's already said, some of them have backed him. And then if you look at global sport, Trump is a firm supporter, for example, of Live Golf. And therefore you would expect them and their organisers and their politicians and their officials, because it goes all the way up to someone like Yasser Al-Rumayyan, the Newcastle United chair. The expectation is that these kinds of people will be quite glad to see Trump coming back into power. So domestic sport, question mark, World Cup probably okay, and international sport, a lot of them that have affiliations with the US government or Trump might be quite glad to see him back in power.
Well, as Stefan says, it is day one, so we will see how it all plays out across his presidency. Now, it's been a tough start to the season for Arsenal, and have things just got a little more rocky at the Emirates as well? The sporting director, Edu, has left the club in a surprise move, and it's reported he'll link up with Nottingham Forest owner Evangelos Marinakis in a new role. The Brazilian had been a key part of Arsenal's transformation under Mikel Arteta. So how much of a headache is this exit? Ben, I want to start with you because I think it's fair to say this came as a bit of a shock, really. What do you think has been the key motivating factor behind this move?
It was a surprise to many in the senior hierarchy at Arsenal. My understanding is that when Mikel Arteta recently signed his new deal, at that point he didn't know that Edu was departing. And then you have James King returning to Arsenal as director of football operations, and at least in the short term and maybe in the long term, fulfilling a lot of the roles that Edu was undertaking. So Arsenal have somewhat of a plan, but again, it wasn't like King was brought back to the Emirates Stadium in order to replace Edu. Arsenal did not know until the week before that Edu was contemplating leaving, and the resignation coming mid-season does hamper them somewhat ahead of January in particular. I think by summer 2025, they'll have everything in place. But the Arsenal project doesn't change just because Edu leaves. So I'm sure that Arsenal will be surprised but still calm about the situation. And then the appeal for Edu to go and potentially work for Marinakis, although he does have other opportunities on the table, is this multi-club. And it's interesting because Nottingham Forest are above Arsenal in the table at the moment. They are multi-club. Olympiacos, Rio Avenue are both part of that particular multi-club group. And a bit like when Michael Edwards joined FSG and therefore effectively returned to Liverpool, but in a broader role, Edu wants more power. Edu wants control to actually fulfill a strategy. Edu wants to be global and bigger picture. And my understanding is that Marinakis has basically said, you can go out and lead on buying another high-profile club to add to and expand this multi-club network. So it'd be wrong to think if Edu does sign, and nothing is signed at the time of recording, that this is somehow Edu being poached by Nottingham Forest. This is very much Edu going to a multi-club model and feeling like also he has the ability to develop young Brazilian talent and give them pathways. If you look at Savinho, he came through City Football Group to Man City. If you look at Andre Santos, he's at Strasbourg, very highly rated. He'll go back to Chelsea. Endrick was signed, so was Kendry Paez and Esteval Willian. So there's this new trend towards young Brazilian talent. And then you have Edu, a Brazilian, and Arsenal, a club that have always had a rich history of bringing in Brazilians, but they've not really been in the conversation for some of the players that I've just mentioned. And part of that is not necessarily having the multi-club and the pathways. So that young talent from South America in particular really feels like they're going to get minutes and they're going to get developed, because they won't always be ready to be catapulted straight into a club of the magnitude of Arsenal. So Edu's looked at all of that and felt that it's the right time to leave. And this is not about rejecting Arsenal's project. It's about wanting more power and effectively wanting to lead on an ambitious multi-club model.
Ben, you mentioned there's surprise from the Arsenal hierarchy. That's what you're hearing. Is there also anger? Is there discontent because of this move happening mid-season?
I think it's amicable, and from the club's point of view, there is a protection element. So if your sporting director is going to leave, you want them to leave quickly rather than stay on and continue to understand your strategy and the project. It's not like a player or a manager where you may say our preference is to stay until the end of the season and then have a clean break. If Edu was to stay, then not only is he going to know what's happening in January and the summer and work on it, but clubs are working 3 to 5 windows ahead, and it's arguably more unsettling if your sporting director stays, even though you might think in the short term there's that kind of continuity. And with James King coming in, I think Arsenal are calm that they've got the resources incoming and the resources in-house to be able to deal with this situation. And it's not abnormal. When Dan Ashworth was first linked with Manchester United, he was immediately placed on gardening leave. So we constantly see this trend towards clubs wanting to protect their own information, their strategy and their process. And a player might be very beneficial to score the goals or keep the clean sheets to take you to the end of the season. But actually, it's more likely that the club, rather than the sporting director, and Arsenal rather than Edu in this case, were the ones wanting that resignation quickly to make sure that there's a clean break.
Stefan, in your view, how much of a blow do you think this is for Arsenal losing Edu, or do you think it's something that a club the size of Arsenal will be able to deal with? Hire someone else who'll be able to do a very similar job to the good job that Edu did.
I think there's a bit more to the story than is being presented. To be honest, there seems to be a missing piece. Very, very rare that you would have somebody walk out and resign without a position sort of in place, and quite rare that they would do it at this stage of the season. If it is going to a Marinakis group, you would have thought that Arsenal would have wanted some compensation in the way that Manchester United wanted compensation from Newcastle United. So there's a missing piece.
What is that missing piece?
I don't know.
Is this a power issue? Is this...
It could be, and that could also go on to answering your next question as to whether it's an issue. Because clearly, if it is a power issue, and if it is some kind of disconnect between the manager and the sporting director, then clearly it will be for the benefit of the club going forward, because you can't have that kind of dislocation. But I think overall, if actually it's purely about Edu wanting a bigger challenge or a bigger responsibility, then I think it will be damaging for Arsenal in the short term. I think any sort of break of the stability and the development of what they've seen at Arsenal over the last 5 years, I think is damaging. But that's not to say that it can't be addressed with a new hire. I mean, City have dealt with their succession issue on that side of the business. By hiring from Sporting, Hugo Viana. And we'll have to see what Arsenal's solution is for that. But it's an important role in a modern football club. And I do think that if there is a sort of specific reason why he's left, which we just don't know, then I do think it could have an impact. And I do think it could be a negative to the Arsenal progress over that period, but we'll have to see.
As much as the next hire is obviously incredibly important in terms of the person they bring in, is the speed of the next hire also important, given that the January window is coming up? Of course, a club like Arsenal, the forward planning is going to be well underway as well. So how important is it not just for them to get someone who they feel is right for the role, but also to get them in quickly?
Yeah, well, I think with these situations, they won't rush it. They'll have other people who can deal with the hiring and firing. It's something City had to deal with when they lost Omar Barada to Manchester United as well. And there's clearly a team. It's not the decisions are not by one person or one part of the business. And so I think they won't rush the appointment. They may already have somebody lined up. Again, we don't know. I don't think we've got the full picture of what's really going on there. The story has just sort of come out of the blue for most people. Maybe it's been known about in the background, but certainly from my perspective, it's come out of the blue. And it just seems that there's a missing piece. So they may well have somebody lined up, but if not, I think they'll be very calm about it. January, anyway, we know is not a massive window for most teams. Although Arsenal, there's a lot of noise around maybe Arsenal do need to make a signing in January. But we know the commercial reality of that is that it's unlikely, and therefore they won't be rushing things, and they probably feel that they're well covered to deal with that one window. And it may actually be that things like contracts of existing players are more pressing issues than the transfer market in January. So, of course, they need the team in place. Of course, time is of the essence on all of these sorts of things. But Arsenal are a well-run club. They won't be panicking about any of this situation, even if it's unexpected. And it may not be that unexpected. It may well have been part of some plan. So I think they'll be calm.
Ben, do you go along there with Stefan saying there's a missing piece to all of this? And also, just from a fan perspective looking at this, would there be a worry that Edu is potentially leaving because, I don't know, he maybe doesn't see the vision of Arsenal in the same way, doesn't see the project going forward in his eyes as far as maybe the fans would want to see?
I think the missing piece is just that Edu became sporting director in 2022, even though he'd been at the club for longer. And in 2022, Arsenal were talking about multi-club, and it hasn't happened. So the feeling for Edu is that how you succeed is in a model like Jim Ratcliffe's trying to build at Manchester United, like Badad Egbali, Todd Bowley, and Jose Feliciano are building at Chelsea, and therefore falling behind is down to the fact that you don't have these other clubs, you don't go global, you don't give young players pathways, because football's changing. And with the market so inflated, people are looking in new regions, or they're going to established regions like South America, and they're having to buy younger. And when you sign a teenager, as I said before, they're not always ready to be thrown straight into Arsenal, nor do you want to, because you're putting pressure. And that may even be the case with a top player like Lenny Yoro. Liverpool felt like he needed 3 years. Manchester United, when he's fit, are going to put him right in the deep end, and we wait and see which approach is right. So this isn't about Edu not believing in the Arsenal project. It's perhaps about Edu wanting more power, and that's the missing piece. And I think his frustrations have probably grown over a longer period of time than has been reported, but also maybe a challenging of the Arsenal infrastructure, because if you want the players that Edu's trying to bring in, if you want the long-term success, if you want to move forwards, not backwards, then it does feel like multi-club is the way. And Arsenal are not there yet. And maybe if you look back to the summer, Liverpool with Michael Edwards joining FSG are thinking about multi-club, and they tried for Bordeaux, but it wasn't financially viable. As I say, you've got Chelsea and Strasbourg, but they'll add more. You've got City Football Group, which is already established, and you've got other clubs like Forest in the Premier League that are already multi-club, and Arsenal are not. And I think Edu gets to the point where if he's only Arsenal, then there's not much more that he can do in building the project. So he walks away to a different challenge with more control and more power. And that's what I think has happened. And then from Arsenal's point of view, they've got, as I say, James King coming in as director of football operations. He's ex-Arsenal. He went to the FA. He's come back. He can assume the gap. He can control the recruitment. He may even end up being a like-for-like replacement for Edu, or they may go down a different direction. That's still to be determined. But Arsenal are confident they've got the resources. And that also, the last point I would make is that Edu doesn't just leave, even though the resignation feels very abrupt. Edu will have already put in place plans for January, for summer 2025, and probably January and summer 2026 as well, because clubs are always working ahead. So whoever does come in, and when King starts again at Arsenal, there will be that handover. He will inherit some kind of continuity, and that's why Arsenal are calm about the situation.
Ben, where does this leave Arteta as well? He had a good relationship with Edu. You'd imagine he'll have a very big say on who comes in next as the new sporting director as well. But where does it leave him in terms of the power balance at the club? And do you feel that Arteta potentially would maybe benefit from this from a power sense? And do you feel that that's maybe something that he would want?
Well, Mikel Arteta had a very close relationship with Edu, and Edu involved him heavily in the pitches for players, even the ones that were not successful at a very early stage. So the key is going to be building that chemistry and making sure that Arteta gets on with and has a close working relationship with the sporting director. I come back to Newcastle again. Eddie Howe and Dan Ashworth had chemistry, and Eddie Howe and Paul Mitchell are still building chemistry. They'll get there in the end, but it's definitely not the same. And it was a difficult summer for Newcastle United. There's always a danger when you change the dynamic that it can set that working relationship back between manager and sporting director. But the good news for whoever comes in is that Mikel Arteta as an individual is very hands-on, meticulous, and wants to be involved in the recruitment process. And Arsenal will afford him the responsibility and the power to have a say over who is the new sporting director, but then to continue to be fully invested in that recruitment process. So although Arteta doesn't have a veto, he works hand in hand with the sporting director, and I don't expect that relationship to change. Arsenal are confident as well because they've done all of their legwork on this project. They've had 18 months of renewing key contracts of players that they are invested in. So the legwork of protecting the spine of the team and their value and giving them long-term contracts has all been done. And it kind of culminated with Mikel Arteta signing his own new deal, which was never in doubt, despite some relatively spurious links with Barcelona. So when you add all of that up, it's actually, if you analyse it in hindsight, quite a good time for Edu to go, because he leaves at a point where Arteta's safe, the core of the squad are signed to long-term deals, and therefore, as long as Arsenal get on a firm financial footing, they will be able to do further business in the market and strengthen the squad. The bigger challenge for Mikel Arteta is not Edu's departure and who that next sporting director is going to be. It's actually keeping pace this season in the Premier League to make sure that the fan base don't lose faith in the project, because Arsenal competing for Premier Leagues shows the project is working and stable and that it's going to bear fruit and ultimately trophies. But if, for example, this season, Arsenal end up 5th, 6th, 7th, and Edu departs, that's when amongst the fan base, potentially, the alarm bells might start ringing. And the optics of that won't necessarily be a good look for Arsenal. So it is actually important that Arteta doesn't get drawn into the politics, doesn't get sucked in to a new sporting director or even January plans, because it's going to be quite quiet, and focuses on getting Arsenal back up there competing or close to Man City and Liverpool. Otherwise, if they fall outside of that top 4 by the festive period, it's going to put a lot of pressure on Mikel Arteta.
Stefan, very quickly, Edu's legacy. Now, they actually had the 3rd highest net spend when he was there, behind Chelsea and Manchester United. That's since he joined in 2019. If we look at it purely on silverware, it's only 1 FA Cup. But is that fair to completely judge him on? Do you think he overall has been a success or a failure?
No, I think the whole Arsenal project, for want of a better word, over the last period where he's been centrally involved, has been a huge success. So regardless of the trophy number that's won, I mean, the progress, I think, has been clear on the pitch, and they've made a number of excellent signings. Clearly, it can always be better, but we know that no signings are guarantees, and also players sign for different periods. You know, I think if you particularly look at, say, the 2 signings they made from City, in Jesus and Zinchenko, they were about making the step, and so we may look at it now and say, well, they've not been huge successes, but actually, they were about the progress that was made. Clearly, they're under some pressure right now as we sit here today, because the side has dropped a few points. But the reality is that over the period that Edu's been involved in the club, there's been an immense improvement on the pitch. And that's partly been Arteta, clearly, but it's also partly been Edu. So I think he's done an exceptionally good job. And I think he would be recognised around the game as having done so. You know, I think it would be very unfair to sort of break down every signing and say, well, this one slightly overpaid here, and, you know, this one, oh, they could have got him for a bit cheaper, and why didn't they sign this guy? You know, the reality is transfers are incredibly competitive, and they aren't an exact science, and Arsenal have done pretty well.
Yeah, it's been a bit of a hit rate for them as well, and it could be a bit of a coup as well for the Marinakis project. Let's look at another story, though, involving politics and football, a bit closer to home, because there's an interesting report out this week revealing that senior members of the British government's Foreign Office have requested information on Man City's financial battle with the Premier League, as has the British Embassy in Dubai. Stefan, I'll start with you. What's your initial reaction to this?
I think very understandable that would be the case. We've spoken before about the scale and the seriousness of the allegations that are made in terms of City, the various local sponsors in the United Arab Emirates, and a number of individuals who are involved in the government of the UAE. So it is not a surprise that the embassy wants to be kept abreast of developments, because a finding by the Premier League's independent commission against City will naturally make the case against those individuals and those companies. So it would be very serious from a diplomatic perspective if the independent commission found against City. But what I think it does also confirm is that those lines are quite, and those walls, those information barriers between the Premier League, the government, and other parties are actually quite strong. And the embassy clearly has not been in the loop, either from the British government or from the local UAE government. So, I think it's understandable. But I think it also does reinforce the independence of the process that's ongoing.
Ben, Is that a bit of a surprise, as Stefan says there, that it feels as if, the government have been kept out of the loop until this moment?
It'd be more worrying if they were kept in the loop, because this is supposed to be an independent process. And what we've noted from the Freedom of Information Act requested by the Times is two things. Number one, can there be a one-pager updating on the situation? And number two, what are the key lines? Now, key lines are effectively more what you may brief, either within meetings or eventually to media. And those key lines essentially say that it's nothing to do with the government or the Foreign Office, and therefore all you're going to get is basically that the Premier League has its own process, it's independent of government, and when it runs its due course, we'll find out what the verdict is, and also it will be published, and the expectation is that will be next year. So there's nothing untoward with that, nor is there anything particularly atypical about a back and forth to try and get the updates. But the one-pager has a little bit more of a grey area, because if that is provided, does it, for example, give any insight or any type of head start for the government to then react or potentially get involved? Now, in this case, there's no implication that that one-pager was even provided. But what we need to make sure, especially with an independent football regulator also coming in the future, is if the Premier League can self-govern, and if this independent panel is also separate from the Premier League because they're referring the charges to it, it has to be able to run its full course privately without the government getting a head start, because that's when you start to wonder whether there can be any kind of influence. And we've had this back and forth with the government getting involved in the Newcastle United takeover, despite Boris Johnson saying that they were not involved. And now we have further correspondence, two lots, in fact, also asking for an update on the Manchester City case. So I think you would expect the government to want to know what's going on, but actually all signs suggest that the Premier League and its independent panel ultimately have not engaged, and therefore the government are as in the dark as we are at this stage.
Stefan, Ben brings up that Newcastle example there. We've also got this situation as well. Do you think that it's fair that the government should have a right to know what is going on in these cases to an extent, or do you actually think that these should be independent of themselves, and actually the government to an extent should be kept in the dark?
Certainly in relation to the City situation, there will be very serious consequences if the Independent Commission found against City and therefore made out those allegations against nationals from one of our main trading partners in the UAE.
Do you go along with what Ben's saying, though, that actually this would be the job of an incoming independent regulator?
Well, it's outside of the remit of the regulator, in fact. So
So that wouldn't solve this kind of situation, then?
Not really. I mean, part of the change that came in with the latest set of rules in relation to the regulator was to remove the element of consideration of who the trading relations with a potential buyer. Okay, so that is now outside of the remit on that side. But it's not going to deal with the Manchester City situation or a regulatory investigation. The independent football regulator is not going to get involved in the day-to-day running of the Premier League in this way, or the financial regulation of the Premier League. And in any event, overlaid on all of this stuff is going to be political reality. So even though it's been removed from the remit of the independent regulator to specifically consider the trading implications of what a takeover might look like for one of our trading partners, I can guarantee you that if it happens again with another nation that is a key partner, those conversations will take place at the highest levels, regardless of whether it's within the remit of the independent regulator or not, because it's political and commercial reality.
Ben, do you think that there's a world where it should be under the remit of an independent regulator coming in, or is Stefan correct in the sense that actually it's just going to have to be something that they leave for the clubs and the Premier League to decide themselves?
Well, not necessarily in the context of this case. It's more that if you take a step back, the independent regulator will have remit and say over who comes into a football club in the first place. And as a result, we may not get a repeat of certain owners or certain scenarios, because the independent regulator may take a different view over who is fit or unfit to, one, come into a football club, or two, when they are embedded in that football club, whether or not anything changes. And it's that extra layer of separation. So at the heart of this is not necessarily a link between the 115 charges case and the independent football regulator. It's more just the Premier League at the moment have a necessity to show that they can self-govern and self-regulate. And every single time that their transparency is called into question or their process is accused of being slow or flawed, the independent regulator hovering provides a debate and puts extra pressure almost on the Premier League in order to maintain their position of power. Because make no mistake, the Premier League will have to accept the independent football regulator, but they'd rather that it doesn't exist because they want to run a league without any kind of challenge. They want to make the maximum amount of marketing money. And in addition to that, they want to self-govern and they want to self-regulate. And the independent regulator will change that dynamic. So every single time the Premier League is now in the public eye, it puts a question mark over whether their own structure, whether their own process is right going forwards. And that's why, for example, if we were to find out, and there's no suggestion of this at this stage, that the Premier League were backhanding information to the government or giving them a head start or ceding to a government position because it's better for international relations, regardless of what the football decision is. If any of that ever happened, then again, you come back to, is the Premier League genuinely capable of transparently self-governing? And that's why these cases are important, even though it's true what Stefan says. The regulator can't just come in and take over like for like, but there's still that link because the Premier League now know that there's scrutiny and new scrutiny coming from outside.
Well, just to build on that, I think one of the biggest fears that the Premier League has had about the regulator has been about mission creep. And I think that link that Ben talks about is a pertinent point, because I think the fear will be that whilst the remit will be the remit on day one, what does the remit look like going forward? And if the more issues that are not dealt with in a visibly satisfactory manner by the Premier League and its processes, the more risk that there is that a government down the line adds to the remit of the regulator once it's set up, once it's got that kind of infrastructure and leadership structure around it. Then the fear will be that other things get bolted on to the remit of the regulator. And the big fear, I think...
Who provides that remit as well?
Well, it will be government-led ultimately in terms of things that are added later on to the remit. I think the remit is the remit on day one. So in the bill that's going through Parliament now, that will broadly set out the remit of the regulator. That will then be entrenched within an actual body and with an actual team and with resources and with funding. And the funding is going to be important because right now, there's no possibility that even if everybody wanted to, that a independent football regulator could deal with financial regulation of the Premier League or even broader financial regulation of the entire 92 clubs. It would be impossible because the infrastructure required to do that, both from a financial and also from a legal perspective, would simply be too grand a job and would cost too much. And we know, we talked about the £50 million that the Premier League spent just on its legal cases last year. That's on top of its internal costs. We know that this is an enormously expensive process just in terms of the Premier League teams. So if you were to try and add in, all of the clubs with all of the complexity and all the differences in each of the clubs, that would be an enormous challenge. So ultimately, they want to get it set up. They want to give it a fairly limited remit, actually, on day one, despite the changes that have been made by the Labour government, that it's a fairly limited remit on day one. But the fear, as I say, from the Premier League is if they don't get their house in order, their fear will be that over time, those political issues around regulation will be passed to a regulator. And the more that the regulator has control of those issues, the bigger an issue it is for the Premier League itself.
Do you feel that the challenge is too enormous, too complex for them to get their house in order?
Yeah, well, no, I think the Premier League right now is the best place to manage its regulation, in my view. It's the best funded organisation. It's got the most power in respect of its own clubs, and therefore it is well placed, providing the rules are set out correctly and providing it's acting appropriately in terms of its leadership and its regulation. I think the Premier League is the best place for it. But they have to be wary of a perception that they're failing to do that, because that perception will ultimately end up being a driver for people to move it over to a regulator. And that's the worst case scenario for the Premier League, because what then happens is it loses control of its own regulation. There'll be issues with FIFA and there'll be issues with UEFA, but if it becomes a political issue, there's real risk there for the Premier League.
Gents, if we stick with Manchester City just for a moment, there have been reports this week suggesting that a number of Premier League clubs will look to seek compensation should Man City be found guilty of their 115 charges. Ben, I'll start with you, because we saw Jose Mourinho joke a couple of weeks ago about getting a retrospective medal for coming second to Manchester City when he was Manchester United manager. He also joked about getting compensation as well for that. In terms of the compensation that a number of clubs may be seeking here, how much are we potentially talking, and do you think that it might be a possibility?
I think the amount we're talking won't be known until we know the severity of the charges, but collective action is very possible. I think that we've seen this before in the case, for example, of Everton or even Nottingham Forest, where the teams that went down said, hang on a minute, we wouldn't have gone down if that punishment had been given earlier and if a guilty side stayed in the Premier League. The ones that went down, it was basically collective action between teams like Leeds and Leicester City and Southampton. They were all able to gang up and say, there might be a way of seeking compensation. So there is a very realistic chance that if Manchester City are punished, it will open the door for some kind of collective action. In addition to that, you may see a shifting of honours, as Jose Mourinho joked about in that season when Manchester United under Mourinho finished second. Mourinho had said that was one of his best achievements as a manager. So we're going to have to wait and see. The hearing itself could finish as early as mid-November, but the actual decision will not be known in the public domain until early next year. And then we'll start to understand the severity. And the reason why I say caution is needed, and that also extends, therefore, to potential compensation and who may challenge Manchester City and the Premier League over what, is because these 115 charges are seen as one by one by one. And most people from the outside in look at the number and instantly believe that even if they prove 1, 2, 3, 4, there's going to be a very big punishment. But you should more look at the charges as grouped into, I believe it's 5 categories. And one of those categories is non-cooperation. And Manchester City simply haven't cooperated. So they're likely to get some kind of sanction for that. And most of the other charges fall under 4 categories, which means that if Manchester City are able to prove innocence in a category, you might find that it is a repeat charge season on season on season. So a lot of charges drop off. And that's why we have to wait and see how many categories, not just specifically charges, Man City are found guilty of before we understand the magnitude of the punishment. But of course, were they to be found guilty, and they vociferously deny any guilt at this stage, then every single club in the Premier League is going to be looking at, did they take a trophy off us? Did they take extra prize money or television money off us? And then if you look at it a bit deeper, what if you were a team that went down by 3 points and you lost twice to Manchester City in that season? Could you then say, we want that back? Could you then say somebody else beat Man City and those 3 points could be rescinded? So this isn't just a case of Jose Mourinho and Manchester United in second, supplanting Manchester City in first. This is a case of everybody in every season, if Manchester City are found guilty, redoing the table, removing the Manchester City equation, and then you might find the top 6 is different, the bottom 3 is different, and if you were impacted, there will be a door open to try and sue either individually or collectively for damages.
This also brings me on to another question, and I want to put this to you, Stefan, as well, because obviously, hypothetically, the retrospective silverware for these clubs may not even be something that they want because they won't feel like they've properly achieved it, given that Man City on the day were the ones that picked up the trophy and won it. But the other question is the inner workings of the club as well, because, you know, let's say there were player bonuses for winning a league title. Now, if these retrospective retrospective trophies are given out, you know, what do clubs do? Let's say there were Liverpool players that maybe would have got a bonus for winning the title, Man United players as well, staff members too. How would clubs work that out if that were to happen?
A lot of what Ben went through is accurate in that you can't look at it in terms of 115 charges. You look at it in buckets and causes of action as it will be. And you'll also look at the materiality of those things that are, if they are proven against City, that are proven. This is a deeply complex issue if it was to occur. So I think it's even beyond whether trophies are reallocated. There is clearly an issue if the charges are proven on the most serious matters in respect to City. There is definitely an impact of some scale against other teams, and therefore it will also be an impact over a number of years. Now, exactly what that impact is from a financial perspective is really, really hard to assess, certainly now, but even for the processes that are in place to do it. Now, if you look at the situation with Everton, we know from the Everton decision, the first independent commission decision, that a number of clubs, as Ben mentioned, had, under the Premier League rules, applied to the independent commission for potential compensation should the finding go against Everton. We don't currently know whether anything came of those claims, and we may never know. It may have been that they were all dropped, it may have been that they were all successful, we just don't know. But within the Premier League rules are two things. One, the clubs can't sue each other in the courts. So the idea that this can go off and be a series of high court claims, club versus club, is not going to happen. There are then two routes. Either it can be dealt with by the independent commission under their powers, and under their powers they have potential to offer unlimited compensation to affected clubs, third parties, or alternatively it can be dealt with through an arbitration process, a separate arbitration process. Now, it is likely that the big issue that the clubs are going to have, anybody that tries to make a claim against City, is going to be on causation, i.e. did those things that are proven against City cause a loss? And if they did, what was the scale of that loss? And then just to complicate it further, under English law, there is a concept of a loss of a chance. So it doesn't necessarily need to be that it was certain that but for City's breach, a team would have won the league. It could have been that they might have won the league, or that they had a 20% chance of winning the league. And that can also give rise to a compensation claim. The point I'm trying to make is it's incredibly complicated in terms of knowing exactly how this will pan out. And really the key thing that would be a concern for me in terms of the regulation of the entire game and the issue is just the number of clubs that are involved. So over 9 years, you've probably got, I don't know, let's say 35 teams were in the Premier League over the time. I don't know how many teams were relegated, but let's say there's 30, 35 teams. All of them may have a claim for at least one position in the league. Well, one position in the league is still £2 million. So you may have numerous teams with numerous claims, with numerous causes of action in respect of that claim.
And just for clarity, it would be Manchester City asked to stump up that bill?
I think
each team?
Yeah, I think if these claims were proven against City, then it would be City who would be liable ultimately for the compensation, providing that the process and the causation was proved as well as loss. So it's a complicated process to get to that point, and of course there'll be appeals and there'll be all sorts of submission made in respect of each club. It's very hard to see how an independent commission or even arbitration panels, multiple arbitration panels, can deal with such complexity. But that's what they'll have to do under the rules if the most serious charges are proven against City. And of course, it remains a big if.
It's really interesting, that point of causation as well, because when you look at how close some of those title races in particular were, I think especially with Liverpool as well, essentially what you're saying is the closer that they were to Manchester City, the better their case will be. But also, I want to ask you about those other clubs that Ben mentioned, the ones that say, well, you know, we lost twice to Man City that season. We missed out on staying in the league by 6 points. Yeah. Are you saying that because of where Man City were as a club, they will have more chance of arguing, well, hold on, you weren't going to come to the Etihad anyway and get 3 points, so we're not going to pay you a compensation?
Well, look, we don't know. So it's incredibly complicated. First of all, we don't know what the findings are going to be. But, you know, if we're talking about the sorts of wholesale breaches that are alleged over a number of years, the implication is likely to be very serious in terms of the assessment of the Independent Commission on the impact that it made in a sporting sense. So I would expect that if the Independent Commission found against City, it is likely to make some pretty firm statements that City had had some pretty major sporting advantages over the period of the allegation. And that's, again, I must be clear, that's if proven from the material side of things. But if that is the case, then all of these sorts of factors that you're talking about could well come into play. So it may well be that a smaller team or even a bigger team says, well, you know, if City had not breached in that way, then maybe X, Y, and Z would have happened. And if X, Y, and Z would have happened, then the consequences may have been something different to what actually occurred. Now, it will likely be very difficult for those clubs to prove each of those elements. But that doesn't mean that people won't try, and it doesn't mean that there's not going to be a long hearing that's going to have to assess the submissions in respect of each of these cases and decide whether actually there is causation and whether there is loss. So it's an enormously complicated situation in the event that there is a finding against City. And of course, we also have to be aware that any independent commission is probably going to be subject to an appeal. And then we'll also have to see what the appeal says, just for a bit of added complexity to the situation.
Yeah, well, it will certainly keep us in a job, won't it, for a long time.
It will keep the lawyers in a job, that's for sure.
It will indeed. Yeah, plenty of ifs and buts at the moment. We'll see how the case plays out. Now, it's time for our talkSPORT Explainer. This is the part of the show where our panellists try and make sense of the question on everybody's lips. And right now, that is, how much exactly did the Erik Ten Hag venture cost Manchester United? Well, it's been reported that his compensation after his dismissal was £15 million alone, and that was boosted after his contract was extended in the summer, only, of course, for him to be sacked after just 9 Premier League games this season, with Manchester United sitting currently in 14th place. Before we deep dive into the amount of money spent on Ten Hag's reign, Stefan, can we see any sense in Ineos giving Ten Hag that contract extension in the summer and more money to spend, only to then sack him in October?
Well, I think there's two parts to that question. The first one is in terms of his contract. So they exercised an option. I suspect that they needed to, once they decided not to replace him, they needed to exercise the option, partly for the optics within the dressing room, to show a level of support. And I suspect that within his contract, it didn't alter the amount of compensation that was going to be due to him going forward. So from that perspective, it was broadly neutral from a cost of sacking him going forward. I think the issue clearly that we've talked about is the spending that was permitted along the lines of players that he seemed to have had an involvement in over the summer, and that does seem surprising. In hindsight, the issue there, of course, is what do you do? What is the alternative? Once you have decided that you are going to retain the manager, you almost have no choice but to support the signings around him. And look, and United were in the difficult situation over the summer where they had this transition of management with Dan Ashcroft coming in and Omar Barada coming in at various times during the summer, and maybe there was an issue with having it all sufficiently joined up to make sure that the signings that were made could be applied to future managers and to future coaches. But of course, in any event, that's an incredibly difficult thing to do because you don't know at the point that you're buying the players who your next manager might be if this one fails. So unfortunately, I think once they decided that they weren't going to replace him, a lot of the cost that's come from it was just, unfortunately, a fact of life. It doesn't look very good from the outside, and it particularly doesn't look good against in the context of sacking, for want of a better word, 250 people, or making redundant 250 people at a cost of £10 million, because of course that's an enormous amount. That's an enormous issue for those 250 people, and the amount turns out to be less than it costs to replace the manager. And that's going to be a painful thing for people to deal with across the club, and I'm sure it has an impact on the overall morale of the organisation. But once they decided to keep him, they'd locked themselves into a difficult situation unless he succeeded.
Ben, when we look at the time that Ten Hag was at the club, and Ineos have inherited this as well, which is the point I want to come on to. But, over 600 million spent on players, just under 50% spent on former Ajax players, so players that Ten Hag, for the most part, knew and had worked with before, players such as Anthony and Andre Onana as well, among many, many others, and a lot of those haven't worked out yet for Manchester United. Do you think there'll be a real shift in the way that Ineos operate in the transfer market, even though they are now bringing in their new man, Ruben Amorim? Will there be a shift in the sense that the manager wanting his own targets, that may not be the case anymore because they want to learn from the mistakes made under Ten Hag?
Well, there's already been a shift in the sense Ruben Amorim is the first ever Manchester United head coach, whereas Ten Hag was a manager, and Ten Hag had a recruitment veto and Ruben Amorim won't. So this is a collective and collaborative recruitment model, very similar to how Chelsea work, for example, with many cooks and freedom to challenge. So that is a big shift and an evolution of the football department. Then we have to work out whether they can find value in the market. You look at Anthony at 95 million euros, Rasmus Højlund at close to 75 million euros, Casemiro at 70 million euros, Mason Mount at 65 million euros. That's a lot of money for players that have had limited return. And maybe some of those players grow into their price tag. Mason Mount has had confidence and injury problems. Casemiro started very well, but he's been played out of position last season, and it looks like to an extent his age has caught up with him a little bit. And Rasmus Højlund struggled to score, then had a purple patch, then struggled again, then got injured, and is now back in the side. So we have to wait and see. The jury is still out. It will be a patient project. My understanding is a 5-window plan from Sir Jim Ratcliffe and his sporting-led team, but they need to find a way of doing business where there isn't this so-called Manchester United tax. They can't just keep spending willy-nilly and then finding if the manager changes, so does the identity, and they're left with a lot of parts that don't fit. And I think that's why they've brought in Ruben Amorim, to embrace this sporting structure, and will be more patient with him. So instead of allowing a manager to just buy, or veto, they're moving towards a more collective and cost-effective model, which over time they believe will pay off.
Have you heard anything about the negotiations they maybe had with Ruben Amorim about this, and how much power he personally wants? Because he is coming in, as you say, as the head coach, but of course he needs a group of players that are going to fit his style and his philosophy. Do you know anything about how much say he will have with these transfers?
Yeah, but also the manager takes the job because he thinks what he's inheriting is moldable. And similarly, the football club hires somebody because they feel that that manager is suited to the squad. So it's not just a case of picking a top coach and then saying, hang on a minute, it isn't a fit. It's the same reason why Arne Slot ended up at Liverpool, because there was continuity from Jurgen Klopp. But Ruben Amorim is somebody that is prepared to put his foot down, is prepared to fight for his cause. If we go back a little bit later and look at Sporting a few years ago when they had Islam Slimani, he didn't like the player. He kicked him out of a training session. He put him in the under-23s, and Slimani never really featured for Sporting again. So Amorim is amenable with the media, but he'll be very forthright behind the scenes. And what he wants is control on the training field without any interference, but is prepared to collaborate on the recruitment side, which is why he's not insisted on a veto. Then in terms of specifics, he, like Manchester United's new look sporting regime, want to lower the average age at the football club and they want to still find a goal scorer, because although there's faith in the long-term potential of Rasmus Højlund and Joshua Zirkzee, a more traditional number 9 that can come in, hit the ground running and score 20 plus goals is still what Manchester United are looking for. And this is why people are saying Victor Gyökeres to Manchester United is the most obvious choice, but he comes with such an astronomical price tag, it might be difficult for Manchester United to do that kind of business. So here's the real big question. Can Ineos in particular find a way of moving in the market despite Manchester United's financial constraints? Or actually, may Amorim have to work with what he's got, because due to financial fair play and PSR, Manchester United are still too restricted? And that's something that Amorim, I'm told, asked about to work out how much money will I have to spend. And he hasn't been given those guarantees that they can go and spend 200, 300, 400 million across the summer or across the season. But he has been told if he can turn things around on the field, they will work away to get him that money needed through outgoings, through creative accounting. So I still think Manchester United will be busy in the market, but whether or not they can afford a Victor Gyökeres remains to be seen.
Well, it was some hat-trick against Manchester City as well. Just,
I mean, I do think if you were to do the maths on the spending, the players that are associated with Ten Hag, who are likely not to have the same value that they're acquired at, the loss of the Champions League revenue for this season, the costs of hiring and then firing him, all of that together may make him one of the most expensive managers in the Premier League history of any club, just because of the scale of United and the scale of these costs. You know, there are very, very significant losses that are going to be incurred, particularly in respect of some of these players that have come out of Ajax, that you would assume are unlikely to be top of Amorim's list of players that he wants to integrate going forward. So I do think it's been an extremely expensive project for United. Yes, of course, they've won a couple of trophies, but I do think it's been an unusually expensive situation.
Yeah, pound for pound, the most expensive manager we've seen in the Premier League.
I struggle to think of one that's been more expensive, just because of the scale of the spending and the loss of the Champions League revenue, and then layered on top of that all of the compensation, wages, and the cost to actually hire him in the first place. You know, people can sort of debate who a more expensive managerial appointment may have been, but you try and work one out. There's not many teams that have spent what Manchester United has spent over the last 3 years and not managed to get into the Champions League, for example. That's a very major, issue. And so I think when you do the maths, this has been a very, very costly error by United over the last 3 years.
Well, it is a new chapter now, though, for Manchester United. That's it from us this week. Thank you very much for your company, and thanks to our panellists, Stefan, Borson and Ben Jacobs as well. See you next time.